called the Biennial Rosso, or 2 red years. In response to that, landowners, industrialists were all too eager to support Mussolini's black shirts, who went around systematically destroying union halls and left centers and party offices. In response to that, the first militant anti-fascist formation formed, called the Arditi del Popolo, or the People's Daring Ones, which incorporated leftists from across the Italian spectrum. But what ended up happening, and this is sort of the first kind of major example of this, but it's an important thread to trace in anti-fascist history, is that the Socialist Party pulled out. They signed a pact of pacification with Mussolini in an effort to work out their differences orally, and the Communist Party pulled out. So after a little while, the only institutional support from the left came from the anarchist movement, though rank-and-file members of all parties continued. Ultimately, the Arditi del Popolo was not up to the task, in part because of this lack of left unity, in part because by the time it formed in 1921, the Italian left was already on its heels, and because Mussolini had a lot of elite support. Let's jump over to Germany for a little bit. So here we have an image of the Red Front Fighters League, which was essentially a paramilitary formation affiliated with the German Communist Party. Here we have basically the origin of the fist symbol. So originally this symbol was more of a communist symbol than an anti-fascist symbol per se, and fists had been used in left imagery previously, but this is where it really dates from. And it's actually interesting that Hitler's adaptation of the fascist salute was in response to this communist fist, because he wanted to have a way for Nazis to respond to the fist. Later on, the fist would become a broader anti-fascist symbol. The German socialists took it up in the early 1930s, and they moved over to Spain, really starting in 1934, but by the Spanish Civil War, the fist was ubiquitous, and of course it spread beyond that. The Red Front Fighters League was not really originally formed as an anti-fascist formation. It was formed as a revolutionary formation, because in the 1920s, and really arguably into the 1930s, the German communists were not principally concerned about the Nazis. They were concerned about organizing for revolution and trying to disparage the socialists. So this is one of the important themes of understanding interwar German left politics, is that the main confrontation for much of it was between the socialists and the communists. This is in part because the official line from Moscow was that, especially after 1928, was that the socialists were social fascists and therefore contributing to the growth of fascism as much as the fascists themselves. This would change later in international communism with the creation of the Popular Front. The Iron Front. The Iron Front was a sort of formation created by the German socialists. Here we see the origin of the 3 arrows of anti-fascism. In the top left image, you can see those arrows crossing out a swastika. That's really the genesis of the symbol. So what happened was there was this Russian emigre named Chakotin who was working with the German socialists and trying to think of some imagery to rebrand the socialists when their support was failing. He saw a swastika on the wall with a line through it, and imagined it as a downward-facing arrow, and then imagined that single arrow as 3 arrows. And that's the origin of the 3 arrows of anti-fascism. You can see it on the flags in the top right here. The socialists holding the 3 large arrows in the bottom left, and so forth. So that symbol was a socialist anti-fascist symbol in the immediate post-war period. It was really predominantly used by socialist parties, but was later picked up as a broader anti-fascist symbol. Now, the Iron Front included the Reichsbanner, which was a socialist paramilitary group, but it was principally designed as an electoral vehicle to try and rebrand the Socialist Party, as the socialist leadership had actually accepted austerity measures from the government, and its support was declining as that of the Nazis and the communists was rising. So, ultimately, when Hitler took power, its ability to militantly resist was non-existent. In response to the Iron Front, German communists created anti-fascist action. Anti-fascist action, as you can see, is the origin of the 2 flags logo of anti-fascism, which has become popular. Originally, the 2 flags were both red to represent communism and socialism, but the idea was not actually to create a broad and left unity, but to try and win over the socialist rank and file away from the leadership of the Socialist Party. Anti-fascist action was essentially the communist attempt to create their version of the Iron Front. It was predominantly an electoral vehicle because, and this is important to understand German anti-fascism during this period, neither the German Communist Party leadership nor the German Socialist leadership actively pursued an offensive militant anti-fascist strategy before Hitler got into power. Here we see an image of the front of the German Communist Party headquarters in anticipation of an election. And it's also worth noting that when the Germans talked about anti-fascism in the early 1930s, they understood basically the government that already existed from 1930 on, that had already kind of centralized power under governmental decree, to be already a fascist government. And in that sense, they had a vision of anti-fascism that's broader than the Nazis and arguably overlooked the Nazis. When Hitler finally took power in 1933, the German Communist Party slogan was, "First Hitler, then us." By which they meant Hitler would get into power, they believed. He would do such a poor job in government that he'd be out 6 months later and the German communists could ride his coattails into power. Now that obviously didn't happen, unfortunately, but it shows how much of the European left, especially the leadership of the European left, did not really take fascism seriously, at least not early on. Part of the reason is because they understood fascism and Nazism to be variants of traditional conservative politics. If you read what some of the anti-fascists were writing in the 1920s, they compared the fascists to the white guards in Russia, to the black and tans in the British Isles. They didn't see that this represented a qualitative change from what right-wing politics looked like in the 19th century. And so I think one lesson that we can take from that is we should never assume that right-wing politics never change, never assume they're monolithic, or that the right of today is necessarily the same as the right of the 1930s. Because if you don't adjust to how their politics change, your resistance is going to be one step behind. And that's certainly part of the story here. It wasn't really until, in a broad sense, the Spanish Civil War that the European left started to see the anti-fascist struggle as a struggle against extermination. Here's the situation where you get the international brigades. You have an image here of the Tom Mooney Company of the Lincoln Battalion. The international brigades were anti-fascists from around the world who journeyed to Spain to fight to defend the Spanish Republic against Franco and his fascist allies. And this was sort of an indication of a kind of anti-fascist domino theory, right? If we don't stop fascism in Spain, it will threaten the entire continent, which is, of course, what happened. Now, at the outset of the Spanish Civil War, there was, of course, what seemed, at least on the surface, to be a really promising example of anti-fascist unity. You've got all of the leftists essentially on the same side. But those of you who know the history of the Spanish Civil War know that less than a year later, street fighting emerged between the various factions. We can discuss that later, but I'm not going to get too far into it now. But certainly, it is a cautionary tale that anti-fascist unity is sometimes easier said than done. Before we go to the post-war period, let's talk a little bit about Britain. So here we have some images from the Battle of Cable Street of 1936. So, in short, this was a situation where the rather anti-Semitic British Union of Fascists planned a march through the largely Jewish East End of London. In response to this, over 100,000 anti-fascists and residents of this area and other people showed up to physically block the march. This 100,000 anti-fascists quickly overwhelmed the 6,000 fascists that showed up. And the police canceled the event, and really the battle that occurred was between the anti-fascists and the police that day. And so this has been seen, especially in British anti-fascist history, as a legendary moment of popular militancy, of a way to think through having popular politics and militancy at the same time, and showing that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I'll come back to this later. I think it's a really interesting example. So, when we think about post-war anti-fascism, that's a really main conversation here, right? Because people understand that fascism existed once upon a time, but the real conversation is to show that this did not die out, and resistance to it did not die out. So part of how I frame the book is thinking through some historical lessons that post-war anti-fascists have drawn from this earlier history that informs their politics later on. So I have a chapter 4 that has 5 of these lessons, but I'll just talk about a couple of them. First is to recognize that fascist regimes did not come to power through force. Mussolini was appointed, Hitler was appointed. Right? So the argument is, from an anti-fascist perspective, that parliamentary government is not inherently a barrier to the growth of the far right. We can see that in many cases, parliamentary governments have emergency measures in place so that during times of crisis, power centralized. And we saw that earlier on. So anti-fascists reject the quote-unquote liberal argument for stopping fascism, which entails faith in the parliamentary system to stop them, faith in rational discourse to defeat their ideas, and faith in the police to stop fascists when they do something illegal. Moreover, they argue that fascism can start small and grow big rather quickly. If we go back to Mussolini, we can see that Mussolini's initial fascist nucleus had 100 men in 1919, but grew to 250,000 merely 2 years later. When Hitler first attended his first meeting of the German Workers' Party before he later changed the name to the Nazi Party, the party at that time had 54 members. So the argument that post-war anti-fascists have made is that small groups don't always stay small, and if you want to stop them before they organize another genocide, you assume that every small fascist or white supremacist group could be Mussolini's 100 or Hitler's 54. And that is better safe than sorry. Related to that is the notion that, well, I'll skip that. All right, that's a good starting point for post-war anti-fascism. Let's jump to the 1970s. So, it's important to understand the landscape of post-war Europe. In continental Europe, the governments that emerged out of the ashes of World War II established themselves, both in the East and the West, as official anti-fascist institutions. Even the Berlin Wall, its official name was the Anti-Fascist Defensive Barrier, because the Soviets and their allies considered Western Europe to be not sufficiently denazified and therefore still fascist. That's another conversation. So they established themselves as official anti-fascist institutions. The way they argued to stop the re-emergence of the far right was to make it illegal, to ban Nazi parties, to ban fascist parties, and that's the route that Germany and France and Italy and these other countries took. And so, although anti-fascism was part of the discourse of the left in the 50s and 60s, it didn't emerge in a kind of literal sense again in continental Europe until 70s, 80s, and on. Britain, the story was different because the government had more of this Anglo-American tradition of open political, quote-unquote, freedoms. And so therefore, right after the end of World War II, the fascist movement re-emerged. And in 1946, 1947, 1948, in London, there was a really aggressive campaign waged by fascist groups targeting the Jewish population of London, which led to the creation of the 43 Group, which was this militant anti-fascist group composed of Jewish World War II veterans that fought back against the far right. And so in that sense, the militant anti-fascist struggle in Britain pretty much continued almost uninterrupted from the 1920s to the present. It started to change, though, really in the 50s and 60s and 70s when there was a shift in the far right from being focused on targeting Jews to targeting immigrants. So you have migration from the Caribbean, from South Asia and elsewhere, and fascist groups like the National Front organized campaigns to, quote, keep Britain white. So we're jumping to the 1970s when the face of anti-fascism and the enemy is organizing against changes. So we have an image here of the Anti-Nazi League, organized by the Socialist Workers' Party, and that features a reimagination of the socialist arrows. So rather than the three arrows, they imagine kind of a single arrow or sometimes two arrows. Still in the same tradition, though. And they helped organize the Rock Against Racism concert series, which were hundreds of concerts featuring anti-racist bands that was really designed to push back against efforts by the National Front to foment a neo-Nazi skinhead movement. So for those who don't know, originally skinhead culture and music and tradition was anti-racist. It was the product of a sort of cultural exchange between Jamaican migrants and British working class youth in the late 1960s. The music of that era is awesome, and then a bunch of fascists trying to ruin it. So Rock Against Racism was important to push back in that cultural scene, and that's also part of the anti-fascist argument, is that fascists try to embed themselves in subcultures, in communities, in societies to normalize their presence, and so they argue it's important to push back at every juncture where this happens, and this is one of them. So here you have an image of The Clash, and so historians of music have actually credited Rock Against Racism with that it was the first time that white British society came into contact in a mass scale with Jamaican music. So it's sort of interesting from that perspective as well. That organizing fed into the creation of anti-fascist action in 1985. Here we have an image of one of their periodicals with the slogan, "No Platform." So the slogan, "No Platform for Fascism," is sort of a central tenet of militant anti-fascism. And it's essentially, at its heart, a rejection of the notion that fascist organizing should be allowed to happen, period. Also of note is the fact that anti-fascists in the 80s and 90s in Britain did a lot of IRA solidarity work, in part because British fascists were often supportive of the Ulster Loyalists, so it played a lot into British politics in that era. When we think of post-war European anti-fascism, the two kind of lines to follow are the British tradition and then also the German tradition. So here we have an image of German autonomous anti-fascists holding a sort of a vigil march in remembrance of an anti-fascist named Connie, who was killed when the police chased her out in front of a moving car that ran her over at an anti-fascist demonstration. So the autonomous movement has a very interesting history, which I'm not going to get into right now, but essentially it emerged in the 1980s to defend squatted buildings, to participate in the anti-nuclear movement, to push back against police brutality. But for the anti-fascist struggle, especially in the late 80s into the early 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when this kind of ultra-nationalist wave swept across Germany and triggered a xenophobic neo-Nazi backlash that these neo-Nazis were trying to burn down refugee centers, they were attacking leftists and immigrants indiscriminately. Even a member of the American Olympic bobsled team was assaulted. Amnesty International issued a report that the German government was looking the other way. It was really a crazy time, especially given the history of the country. And the German autonomous anti-fascist movement was, basically one of the main forces on the streets to shut down, neo-Nazi demonstrations on the anniversary of Hitler's birthday in front of the parliament. That's how crazy it got. And here we see essentially the origin of the black bloc tactic, which for those who are unfamiliar, is a street tactic whereby people dress uniformly to obscure their identities to participate in militant political activity. We also see sort of a rebirth and adjustment of anti-fascist symbolism during this period. So on the top right, you have the flags of anti-fascist action from the 30s, and here we have the first example that I could find of the incorporation of the black flag into that logo from a periodical from December 1987. Also of note, if you look at the bottom of the image, it shows that it was published in German and Turkish, because many of the first German Antifa groups of the 80s and 90s were formed by Turks who were under attack and had to defend themselves from neo-Nazi skinheads. What an outlandish proposition. So, always important to understand that every major wave of anti-fascist organizing has occurred in response to fascist organizing. And in that sense, it is a politics of self-defense that many people do not even have a choice whether they participate in it or not. Now, in this early era, the orientation of the flags still flows from left to right as it did in the 30s, but as of a couple of years later, it shifted in the other direction. Don't ask me why, but it usually is in this direction ever since. Let's jump over to the United States. Now, when we think about what anti-fascism is, I think definitions can be very useful, but they can also be limiting at times. So I'm going to take a kind of step back from the literal history to kind of think through some definitions. So when I was trying to think about what anti-fascism is or is not, I started by thinking about what fascism is. And to some extent, I think that it's helpful to think through what Henri Césaire had to say about fascism and Nazism, which was that to some extent we can see fascism and Nazism as European imperialism, colonialism, and genocide brought home to the European continent. That's evident in all too many ways. The fact that the first concentration camps were not built by Nazis. They existed in the Americas for the indigenous population. They existed in Cuba, built by the Spanish monarchy, South Africa during the Boer War, and so forth. That Nazi eugenics were modeled on American eugenics. The list goes on and on, unfortunately. And so if we take that as a starting point for the sake of argument, that we can think of fascism as this specific variant of European imperialism and genocide on the European continent, then I think we can also see anti-fascism, at least explicitly labeled as such, as a specific variant on a longer transnational struggle against imperialism and genocide, and so forth. So, in that sense, you can think of the anti-fascist movement in that broader, expansive sense as going back to 1492, going back to the first slave ships, and so forth. And so, in that sense, the notion of fighting back against white supremacy, genocide, and domination is nothing new by the time we talk about anti-racist action. It goes back far too long in the Americas, Africa, Asia, Australia, around the world. For the purposes of tracing the specific history of Antifa, we can see the influence of that politics specifically for the first time in the United States and Canada with the creation of anti-racist action. So this is a context where anti-racist skinheads, and slight reminder, remember, many skinheads not racist, so these are anti-racist skinheads who were trying to push back against the presence of a neo-Nazi skinhead group in their scene in Minneapolis. Again, a politics of self-defense, of reaction to an immediate threat, not a thought experiment. Okay? So, in this context, long story short, it kickstarted what became the Anti-Racist Action Network that spread across the US, Canada, and Latin America with hundreds of chapters and thousands of members. Here we have an image of their first newsletter, but of course the sort of range of their political propaganda grew over time. They developed 4 main points of unity. 1, we go where they go. The argument that it's always important to have a counter voice, at the very least, to far-right politics. Non-sectarian defense of all anti-fascists, so it was a pan-radical politics. They didn't turn to the police or the state to stop the far-right, again a major tenet of militant anti-fascism, and defense of reproductive rights. So part of what anti-fascist action did, anti-racist action, was to show up at abortion clinics and defend reproductive rights. And that shows an expansive definition of anti-fascism that some people don't recognize. The decision to call themselves anti-racist action came from the fact that the main inspiration for the group was learning about anti-fascist action in Britain, but they decided to use the language of anti-racism because they felt like it applied better to the United States. So you get anti-racist action. And this is really the genesis of the Antifa groups that we see in the US and Canada today. The Anti-Racist Action Network sort of declined into the 2000s, and a new wave of anti-fascist organizing picked up with a greater influence from Europe, which is indicative of the increased tendency to use the Antifa label, and a greater tendency to use some of the symbols of anti-fascism that we've talked about. Today there is the Torch Anti-Fascist Network, which is to some extent the descendant of the Anti-Racist Action Network, and there are groups around the country organizing today. I'm not going to focus a whole lot right now on the kind of today politics, but I'm sure we'll get into that in the Q&A, so I'm going to see what you all are interested in discussing in that regard. But I'll make a few more comments before we open that up, because I don't want to talk at you too long. I think it's interesting to know, when I talk to journalists about anti-fascism, they're really only interested in a few things. Conflict, masks. Did I mention conflict? So it's important to point out that, and we can discuss this a great deal later, but basically, most of what anti-fascists do does not entail conflict. I do try to emphasize that when I speak to journalists, but it's of less interest. But also, I try to emphasize that what anti-fascism can look like organizationally, politically, on the streets, in schools, in society, can mean any number of things. And in that sense, anti-fascism shouldn't only be constrained to one form of activity. So I was really intrigued by some models of anti-fascist organizing that I learned about in Spain and France, for example, where some militant anti-fascists who have their affinity group, who when need be confront the fascists on the streets, also help to create anti-fascist neighborhood assemblies. So in Madrid, for example, they essentially grew out of the 15M or 15M assemblies that emerged from the Indignados movement, and became anti-fascist assemblies when the Hogar Social and other fascist groups tried to recruit in different Madrid neighborhoods. This creation of neighborhood assemblies fed into a larger Madrid-wide assembly of assemblies. Keep up with the assembly. called Madrid for All, and they organized a really large demonstration with the flag images that we see, but the flags were, I think, purple and pink to emphasize the feminism and queer politics of the initiative they're trying to organize and push back against an image of anti-fascism that is sometimes excessively masculine from their perspective. So, when we think through what that looks like, or the attempt today to create, I was just in Michigan, and I met with a bunch of folks from Solidarity and Defense, which is an effort to create a more public-facing, popular anti-fascist formation. That anti-fascism can look like all these different things. But there's more to it than just organizational form. When I spoke to one of the Madrid anti-fascists named Daniel, he emphasized that in his perspective there are two faces of anti-fascism. Okay? One face from his perspective was that which tries to short-circuit the organizing of the far right, prevent them from holding meetings, holding demonstrations, publishing newspapers, forming connections in communities. Kind of active, defensive part. The other part that he emphasized was inoculating society to the appeals of fascism. Building a workers' movement so that when the economy crashes, people don't turn to xenophobia, they don't blame immigrants, they turn to their neighbors, their co-workers, they engage in networks of mutual aid, they build a new world. This is especially relevant when we think of pushing back against the Trump administration, when we think of pushing back against quote-unquote respectable far-right parties in Europe, like the AfD in Germany, or Front National in France. In the third chapter of my book, I speak with a number of anti-fascists from Europe about the challenges that they're facing in trying to organize not just against small or medium-sized far-right parties, but mass parties in parliament with broad popular appeal, right? Who the enemy is has to affect the methods, and so in that sense, there is in some circles sort of a questioning or rethinking of what to do in this circumstance. But I was really intrigued by an answer given to me by an anti-fascist named Jim from the London Anti-Fascist when I discussed this topic, and he said, to some extent, when we're organizing against these mainstream far-right parties, we have to do our politics better than they do theirs. What he meant by that is, at a certain point, if you think about not just stopping them, but building a counterforce that will win people over instead of having them turn to the right, that's sort of a job for the left as a whole, for social justice, working class movements as a whole. And so when you start to think about anti-fascism, not just about targeting explicitly fascist or Nazi groups, but about broader systems of white supremacy, mass incarceration, police violence, then if you think of that as modes of anti-fascist organizing, which I certainly think ought to, then what anti-fascism looks like spreads out. Right? To some extent, anti-fascism can be thought of as an accordion that, depending on what boat you're playing, can be wider or narrower. And in that way, I think the Italian slogan, "Siamo tutti antifascisti," that we're all anti-fascists, is super important, because ultimately, we need everyone to take a part in this resistance. So, I'm going to leave it there, and I'm curious to hear what you say. Thanks.
I see some hands over here.
I guess we're starting over here.
Sorry. Go ahead.
We'll get to everyone's.
Okay. Hi, thank you for coming here and speaking to us tonight. I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia, so there's been some fascist and anti-fascist action there recently. And I wanted to ask you about what role you think artists have as anti-fascists, and also, let's just start there.
Yeah, so the role of artists in anti-fascism. So artists have been involved in anti-fascism at every juncture of their being anti-fascism. And so this points to sort of the kind of direction I was heading in at the end, so thank you for your question, which is there are a lot of different reasons why people will get involved in politics. A lot of different reasons. And so we can't limit ourselves to thinking through politics simply in terms of kind of like arguments, but also in terms of social and cultural milieu, creating spaces of community and inclusion and participation and pushing back through aesthetics. Aesthetics are powerful forces of human activity, right? And so thinking through Rock Against Racism, thinking through the movies and images and murals made during the interwar period, thinking today about the increased importance of hip-hop, for example, in European anti-fascist circles. There are a myriad of ways where not just, obviously not just with anti-fascism, but politics in general, that we should think holistically and think about ways that, some of the people who get involved with far-right groups do so because those are the people they're with, that's the community they're part of, that's what they're inculcated with. And the same goes for the left. And so I think, the slogan of one of the slogans of rock that came out of Rock Against Racism was NF standing for the National Front. NF equals no fun. Right? So this was a lot more fun than the National Front. So I think it has a huge role. And we should create a movement that has spaces for everyone to do their thing, artists included. So, yeah.
So at the beginning of your presentation, you described how leftists were kind of blindsided by fascism. They weren't able to get the same popular support that fascists were able to get, and they didn't adjust their tactics because they kind of thought, well, this is just what we've always been dealing with. So I guess my question is it useful for us to continue using kind of this model of fascism and anti-fascism as what we're dealing with? And is there a chance that we might get blindsided today by the right in its, different transformations?
Super question. One minor caveat is that, in most of these countries, the left was still more popular than fascism, but sometimes divided. So just minor historical caveat. But yeah, that is a concern, right? So that's part of the reason why I emphasize in the book that it's always important to reassess what the far right looks like and assess how we should organize against it accordingly. So there may come a point in the future when the paradigm of fascism no longer makes sense. It may come, we should be open to that possibility, right? There may come a time in the future where the paradigm of anti-fascism makes sense. We should always be reassessing paradigms of modes of struggle, certainly. I don't think we're there yet. I do think that the paradigm of fascism, although what fascism is, what it means, and how it operates has changed in really significant ways over the past decades, I do think it's still a useful paradigm, and the paradigm of anti-fascism is therefore, I think, still a very useful paradigm. But that along with much of anything else could potentially change, and so I do think it's important to be open to that and to be always thinking about what it is that we're doing.
So you also mentioned that fascism has always risen through the state apparatus, through election and being appointed into positions of power, rather than through sort of violent suppression of the masses. And I was wondering what sort of lessons can the left draw from the fact that the far right has been able to take power through the state and organize the masses in that way? What does this say about the relationship of the left to the state and of taking state power?
Sure. So right, the historical fascist and Nazi regimes came through the parliamentary system, not against it. So, any kind of historical fact can be interpreted in a number of different ways based on your political lens, right? I do think that it shows, I'm going to give you my lens, right? That it shows that parliamentary politics in and of themselves are insufficient to stop fascism. I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw. Now, the other side of it is that most parliamentary governments in Europe did not end up that way. But usually they didn't end up that way because the elites of society did not feel sufficiently threatened to give up on the traditional rulers of society. So to some extent, one way of thinking through it is if you do want to build a revolutionary movement capable of creating a post-capitalist society, you're eventually going to have to deal with state repression, and that often comes in the form of a kind of paramilitary auxiliary to the state, or they're overlapping. So in that sense, right, another lesson to consider is to think to some extent of anti-fascism as a facet of revolutionary struggle, even before it's necessarily necessary. That's the argument put forward, for example, by the General Defense Committees of the industrial workers of the world, is to think the working class self-defense before you're necessarily literally under attack is a useful way to think of it. Now, as far as state power, it depends on your politics, right? I mean, if you think that state power is a useful way to stop the far right, then that's what you're going to conclude. And that's certainly what the kind of official anti-fascism of the immediate post-war period concluded, which was to get socialist and communist parties in power, use the legislation, use the state, use the police to crush the far right. Now, the counter-argument is if you see state power as a spectrum tending towards fascistic kinds of outcomes, if you see the police and a carceral system as, if not already fascistic, then inherently with the ability to tend towards fascistic outcomes, then you may not be comfortable with that route of stopping the far right. I'm not. But, once again, that's kind of a political argument that people in this room probably would have a variety of opinions on.
Yeah, I had a question. I was kind of reminded when you were going through your slides, you had a picture of the German autonomous movement. And I was wondering where you would factor in kind of the anti-German, anti-Deutsch movement, because they certainly consider themselves anti-fascist. But they also hold a lot of views that would be considered by most leftists to be very right-wing. For example, I worked with someone who told me that the American tanks invading Afghanistan were the last stand of bourgeois society against the fascist Taliban. And so how do you, as an intellectual historian, how do you kind of figure out what the motivation of those teams were?
Great question. So just as a way of explanation, the anti-Deutsch tendency in the German left is essentially argues that defense of the state of Israel is necessary given the historical legacy of the Holocaust, and connected to that is essentially support for American imperialism. So support for the Iraq War, support for the kinds of things that you're talking about. To most radicals and leftists in the US and other countries, this is like very strange, to say the least. Yeah, I think it's hugely problematic. I interviewed actually an anti-fascist who moved. He's originally from Argentina, but moved to Germany in 2004 and wanted to get involved with Antifa in Germany. And so he showed up to one of the more established groups to their meeting and was like, really eager, wanted to join the group. Didn't realize that his anti-Zionist politics put him in the middle of this argument. And so the anti-Deutsche faction blocked his admission into the group because he was an anti-Zionist. And so essentially the group fractured in half between the anti-Deutsche faction and the other faction. I forgot exactly how they described their politics, but that was anti-Zionist. And to some extent, the German movement can be divided, not just anti-fascist, but the left movement can be divided in these ways. Even to the point where I've seen anti-Deutsche use the anti-fascist flags, with one of the flags being an Israeli flag. So certainly thinking through Palestine solidarity is an important part of anti-fascism. I think that's focused in my opinion. But that is part of the conversation.
So, if I could just say, it's bogus to think. Sorry, by bogus to think about Palestinian solidarity?
No. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I am very anti-Zionist. Yeah, so I disagree strongly with the anti-Deutsche position.
Maybe the topic is too interesting. I was wondering, you touched on this a little bit, especially on the far right. I was just kind of wondering what their relationship to capitalism has been throughout these struggles. Have they always been exclusively pro-capitalist groups? Have they had money relationships? Or has this always been a clear contestation between anti-capitalist and pro-capitalist groups?
Great question. So, the early historical fascist movements in Italy and Germany and elsewhere, at least initially, premised their appeal on being class collaborationist. They were critical of the capitalists who were oppressing the working class class, especially, and critical of the class struggle perspective of socialism, which was detrimental to the interests of the nation or the race, depending on how you look at it. Now, very quickly, the class collaborationist perspective was jettisoned, and alliances were made with industrial and agricultural elites. And so the actual role of the black shirts was to be the paramilitary force of the ruling class and South. Right, so the notion of an actual left fascism, you can see how that actually plays out. Now, in the post-war period, I don't know why I'm even going to this slide because I'm not going to show you anything new, but I'll leave it on this one. Anyway, in the post-war period, there were, without getting into all of the labyrinths of it, a number of fascists who concluded that the jettisoning of quote-unquote left fascism was a mistake. There were attempts to revive that, to create a third way kind of fascism that was more allegedly pro-working class. There were efforts to incorporate tactics of quote-unquote Trotskyist entryism, perspectives on third world liberation oriented towards a white nationalist perspective, any kind of leftism you could think of, even national anarchism, even fascist organizing black blocs in Europe. That happened. So anything you can imagine on the left was dabbled with by the far right in an effort to, to be jerks. So in that sense, the conversation is much more muddled, but ultimately, you cannot be supportive of the ruling class and the working class. Your politics has to choose. They always choose, and they always choose the wrong side of that. And so, especially when the conversation comes about, aren't the fascists and the anti-fascists the same? There's a million ways they're different, but that's one of them. Yep.
Hello. My question is, can you talk to us about the use of the museum as a discursive space by the far right, and what strategies have artists used to combat it?
So by the museum, you mean like turning to kind of Western civilization as kind of in general, and like statues and Greco-Roman history and Nordic history, and is that where you're going?
Yeah, it comes to my mind with the use of Nazis of art as a vehicle for pushing certain discourses.
So inherent in nationalism in general, ultra-nationalism and fascism specifically, is this effort to make it seem like fascists are the guardians of eternal truth and eternal identity, eternal nationhood. And so they'll skew and distort history to get there. One of the more interesting ones is a lot of the ancient statues, especially I think the Roman statues and the Greek statues that are white, those white statues, were originally painted in all sorts of colors, but faded over time. And so a lot of the kind of fetishization of whiteness and white skin color derives from a misreading of what those statues were. So that's like one example. But even the notion of whiteness, of Western civilization, any kind of national identities are used in that direction. And so certainly in that sense, anti-fascist scholarship needs to break down these notions and show how they're bogus, and that this imagined identity has always been at best fractured. And then of course in terms of art, then it brings us back to the question of art, which is to have artistic responses. It's interesting because this is a minor tangent, you'll have to forgive me. I met this painter from the Netherlands who is a hyper-realist painter. His paintings look like photographs, they're amazing. He said that in much of Europe, it's hard for him to get his paintings in galleries because there's this association in Europe of this hyper-realist style being associated with fascism, whereas in the United States, no one understands, that's a cool painting. But so, I'm just bringing it up as an example of how, in some contexts, these associations are much stronger in ways that I don't even fully understand myself.
Thanks for doing this talk, for doing this work, Mark. It's really appreciated. I have two questions, but they really go over on gender, so they're coming from different angles. So one of the arguments that I've heard, and I'm somewhat convinced by it, is in our present moment, folks have made the argument that the rise of the alt-right, which I guess is our instance of contemporary fascism in the US, has a marked distinction in relation to gender, whereas the alt-right kind of emerges out of Gamergate, and whereas in Nazi groups, maybe we see militant women's wings, like traditionalist women's wings in the Nazi group, the alt-right doesn't already have that kind of equivalence. So people make this argument, which the question is whether it's accurate, and what the role of women historically have been in the fascist movement, whether it is actually makes sense to make this case that the alt-right today is a departure, and the fact that we don't see this kind of mirroring of the women's fascist wing that maybe the Nazi parties traditionally have had. And similarly, I'm curious about the historically, you touched on this slightly with anti-racist action in defense of reproductive rights, but I'm just curious about doing research in the early 20th century, on the rise of anti-fascism, whether these kind of debates that seem to be more predominant now around gender, around having maybe distinctions of like feminist anti-fascist actions or feminist anti-fascist wings similarly existed in the past, and what these debates kind of occurred and how the role of gender played.
Great, thank you for that. So I'll start with the first part. So it's true that, well, all right, so to take a step back, right, fascism is all about copying the left and trying to steal things from the left. So fascist mass parties copy left mass parties and left unions and left popular politics. Right? That's sort of the first significant right-wing popular politics. I mean, you can make arguments for proto-fascist movements. That's the original point of the presentation. But, right-wing popular politics as opposed to elite politics of traditional conservatives who owned land and didn't need to actually care what people thought comes with fascism. And so in that copying of the left, they also to some extent copied the left having youth wings, having women's groups, and so forth. Now, of course, just because a fascist or far-right party has a women's group doesn't mean that it's pro-women in any meaningful sense, right? And that's sort of an important lesson to think through all of this. Now, today, right, there isn't that same auxiliary of the alt-right, but I believe that there are some women that are part of some of these fascist and neo-Nazi groups, and I imagine that if they grew, they would essentially create them. So I see it more as a kind of an indicator of their stunted growth than of a dramatically different perspective on women, because ultimately they want to reinstate what they see as traditional gender roles and return to a traditional society which they imagine having existed for all of eternity or something. So I guess I don't see it as dramatically different in its anti-feminism and its misogyny. Now, as far as from the other side, from the anti-fascist side, certainly I don't need to go too far into detail to talk about the limitations of perspectives of gender for the old left. Right? A lot of problems there. I'm not going to go into all of them. A lot of problems, right? And that was reflected in the anti-fascist movement as well. Although not as many problems as nearly as many problems as on the right, so that's always a key to check there. So now, moving into the post-war period, I spoke to, for example, a British anti-fascist who was active from the 80s up to the present. And he described the usual division of gender labor in a British Afro group in the 90s as the women do the research and figure out where the fascists are, while the men hang out in the pubs and have a drink until it's time to crack skulls. That's how he described it in the 90s. Right? And I'm sure that was not the only situation. On the other hand, in Germany, and probably in response to some of these dynamics, there were Fantifa groups created, which are feminist Antifa groups. And that tradition has continued through the present. A year or two ago, there was a queer feminist Fantifa Congress of different Fantifa groups in Frankfurt, in Germany, and there are similar groups in Austria. I'm not sure if that specific mode of organizing has spread elsewhere, but I think it's intriguing. There's an entire book on Fantifa written in German, so if you read German, check it out. Beyond that, I spoke to one of the founders of Swedish Anti-Fascist Action, who said that over time, attention in the Swedish movement to gender and internalized patriarchy got somewhat better as the 90s went along, By the end of the decade, they were organizing gender-based discussion groups to address patriarchal behavior internalized in the movement. To some extent, I got the sense that essentially how good an anti-fascist movement is at dealing with this is to some extent proportional to how good the left of that region or country is. That's the perspective that I got. But ultimately, people can say what they're going to say. You don't really know how things operate in a group unless you're in that group. And I'm not in any groups. So all I got was what these interview subjects said to me, which was essentially, yes, it's a problem. We're trying to work on it. It's still a problem, which to me says really not much of anything. Now, beyond that, I spoke to some anti-fascists in the United States who were really upset by the tendency to portray anti-fascist militancy as something only done by men, and therefore masculine. So I spoke to some women anti-fascists who said that, well, one that I spoke to said that for her, at least, it was empowering to engage in anti-fascist self-defense, considering that society labels her as someone who's allegedly unable to do that. So therefore, anti-fascist militancy was empowering for her as a woman. And so it depends on the context, what's going on. I've spoken to some members of some groups who claim that their groups are majority non-men, that they have a strong focus on this. You can see, for example, in the Madrid for All demonstration with the pink and purple flags and other kinds of initiatives, an attempt to kind of break out of the one image of what this can be. So I don't have a good answer because there is no one answer, but certainly it's a challenge in the left and in society and in anti-fascism. So, thank you.
Thanks. This has really been a fascinating talk, and I appreciate your comments. I'd like you to talk a little bit about how anti-fascists talk about where to draw the line when they apply no platform, because there's a perspective on the far right. It's not just Spencer, it's also Charles Murray, and this is, of course, a question for student activists.
Sure. So, to take a step back, this conversation often happens within the context of the question of the slippery slope. So a lot of commentators who've written about anti-fascism and the politics of no platform have alleged that if you deprive fascists and white supremacists of a platform, you will inevitably slide into no platforming, quote unquote, anyone you disagree with, to the point where you will live in a totalitarian society. Now that's, of course, slightly overstating, but that is the argument that something makes. So I think it's important to address that argument, which I think sets the broader context we're talking about, specifically kind of university speakers. So I looked at that in the research, and I found that if you want to see the lifespan of your average anti-fascist group, it usually has everything to do with the specific organizing they're doing. So if you ask an anti-fascist, when did your group form? Well, it formed in 2009. Why did it form? Well, because there were some hammerskins in our neighborhood who were threatening local immigrant populations. When did your group end? It ended in 2013. Why did it end? Because that group kind of faded away. Their leader moved to another city, and there was a pipeline that we had to organize against that was more of a pressing issue, and so anti-fascism sort of slid down our priorities, and that was we sort of focused on other stuff. So, all is to say that usually, in my experience, speaking to members of groups, when they don't have fascists and white supremacists and clearly far-right groups to no platform, they usually just do other stuff and don't sort of walk around looking for anyone they quote-unquote disagree with in a platform. So when that debate and that discussion is carried out in the media, it's always carried out in abstraction without moving to actual examples of anti-fascism. So I think the notion that there is this tremendously slippery slope is not borne out by the fact that if it existed, it would have happened over the past century. I don't know substantive examples. Now, also worth to clarify is traditional anti-fascism is not really focused on university speakers or individuals as much as organizations and groups. So to some extent, we're having a slightly different conversation, and many of the people who organize against Milo Yiannopoulos or Charles Murray don't necessarily identify as anti-fascists and aren't necessarily part of groups. But certainly the politics of no platform applies, and I think it's worth thinking through in that sense. So where do we draw the line? I think to some extent that's a question in politics in general. Where do we draw boundaries and lines in politics? I think when we look back at political struggles, we have a tendency to assume that these lines are clear, but I think at the time, if you look at internal debates in movements, internal debates in society, lines in politics are always very blurry and contested, and the degree to which they become clear is established through struggle and through movements making their perspectives felt to the point where they're powerful enough to make them common sense in society. All is to say, where the line will be drawn as to who will and will not be platformed will have everything to do with what kinds of political forces mobilize to platform people. I mean, that sort of, it sounds like a truism because it is, right? And in that sense, I think that we can think of politics as the answer. Right now, does that mean that people are going to disagree about who's going to be no platform? Of course. Right? But that's how social struggle happens. That's how politics happen. You know, to look at in a university context, the development of principles of diversity, creation of ethnic studies, women's and gender studies departments, all these are political struggles that happen over generations. I think that this is part of the struggle of this generation, to determine what kinds of dehumanization are outside of the scope of what will allow. I mean, it's messy. Politics is messy. There is no clear line. But to accept that Richard Spencer or whoever can show up and incite violence against immigrants or queer and trans people, that doesn't seem to me to be a solution. That seems to me to be a solution. That's my perspective.
So, in the aftermath of this bill, there's been a sort of common take that equivocates the Antifa movement with the far right. Is there a historical precedent for this? Is this a common tactic, or is this a new thing entirely?
Well, I think it's more of a post-war thing. I didn't really come across that prior to World War II, in part because much of quote-unquote respectable society liked fascism. So there was no need, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing prior to World War II and for a lot of elite opinion. Now, that changes dramatically after World War II. I think part of it has to do with the fact that in Western Europe and North America, Nazism was understood individualistically as a kind of personal evil. That what happened, and this is my experience, at least in school, I don't know if it was yours, when you're taught about what went wrong with the Holocaust, it was people following orders, individuals, and that the lesson is we should all as individuals question things and be good people. And you see that kind of reflected in, you know, a grammar Nazi or a suit Nazi. Basically, Nazi becomes that you're a jerk, an authoritarian jerk. So that loses a lot of the politics of it, and I think it means that when it's reduced to this personal capacity, you see situations where when anti-fascists confront fascists, they're just being jerks, and everyone should just like chill out. You know, that's sort of, and then it's sort of like a slightly caricatured version of what it becomes. So to some extent, I think you can see that, and also more explicitly, that kind of debate has gone back a while. Today, the far-right writer Dinesh D'Souza wrote a book called The Big Lie, claiming that everyone who's not a free market libertarian is essentially a fascist because he equates the state with fascism. So he's one of the main components today of that kind of equivocation. It goes back a little while. I'm not entirely sure its exact trajectory, but it's not entirely new. But of course, this debate in this form hasn't really happened in the United States in a long time, in this way ever maybe. So in that sense, it's kind of a new terrain, I guess. Also, one thing to throw in there is kind of the Cold War school of totalitarianism, which equates the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and of course had a very political context of trying to demonize the Soviet Union by equating it with Nazi Germany in the Cold War. That's another kind of facet of that, related to the notion of extremism, which of course is another useless concept.
Thanks. Yeah, actually, I've got a couple of questions. My first one actually comes right out of what you were just saying.
Super.
What do we mean by fascism? Fascism has been, so overworked and overapplied. I think we need, first of all, a precise historical specification of what fascism is.
Right.
So I'd like to hear you talk about that. Secondly, I'd like to hear you
power.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's a lot of debate now, is Trump fascist? Okay. A lot of people are arguing, yes, he is. That's the line of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Their whole diffuse fascism front.
Sure.
Others draw distinctions between right-wing populism and full-blown fascism. But of course, there is the connection in that full-blown fascism often rides in on the crest of right-wing populist movements. So could you talk a little bit about your view of fascist movements before the achievement of state power?
Yeah, right. So some historians have argued for seeing fascism in stages leading up to its acquisition of power. And to some extent, you can see that what fascism looks like changes dramatically as it gets popular, as it acquires state power. Now, the notion of defining fascism has puzzled historians for a long time, and there is no exact agreement on what it is, though most of its contours are generally accepted. Just to sort of start with the baseline conversation, Robert Paxton, the historian of fascism, argues that really when you kind of tear away all of the noise, the only thing that all fascists have in common is, let me try to paraphrase this somewhat correctly, the desire for the survival of the chosen group, defined as either a nation or a race or what have you. Everything else in this imagined Darwinian struggle can be jettisoned or adopted or rejected. That's what he says. But more broadly, it's an ultranationalism, it's a traditionalism, it's a rejection of what's perceived as kind of a decadent or effeminate modernity achieved through modern politics. There's a lot of kind of paradoxical and contradicting elements to it. Now, of course, what we're getting to is here's the question of how do these kinds of discussions relate today? Now, I don't think that a kind of textbook Mussolini fascist movement is going to rise up anywhere anytime soon, right? No one's going to, it's not as if millions of people are suddenly going to be like, yeah, let's do exactly like Mussolini did. So if we're thinking about fighting against the far right, I think that, one, we should, of course, be very much informed by what these politics have looked like over time, but not necessarily so beholden to what they were like in the 20s and 30s that we allow variations to use us and whatnot. So I try to think through this question, which is a difficult question, and I don't think I've entirely gotten a hold of all of it, in a part of the book where I think I talk about thinking through fascism. I forget what even I said, but I'm going to give you the gist. Essentially, in one sense, in an analytical sense, in a sense where it does make a great deal of sense to understand exactly the difference between fascist and far-right and populist movements, but also thinking through it in kind of a normative or a moral register. So, let's think of, for example, resistance to the Franco dictatorship in the 50s and 60s. Now, was Franco a fascist? Well, not in a textbook sense. Was his regime fascist? Well, kind of. But when you look at the resistance was very clear in calling itself anti-fascist. So, you can say, oh, you know what, you Spanish anti-fascists who were hiding out in the mountains with rifles to fight Franco, you were misguided because really, if you read these books, you'll see that this wasn't exactly fascism. Well, I think that that's missing a kind of experiential anti-fascism related to an experiential fascism that we can have sort of a broader conception. If we talk about, the argument put forward by the Black Panthers that the police were fascist pigs, right? Does that depend upon us to define the United States government in the 60s and 70s as a textbook definition of fascism for that to be true? I don't think it does. And so in that sense, I think it's useful to think through fascism and anti-fascism in different ways. On the one hand, it does make a difference how we define these things in terms of how we define our strategy and tactics and perspectives. And that goes back to the earlier conversation about if we always think of it as monolithic, that can get us into trouble in terms of our struggle. But in terms of our solidarity, in terms of our perspective on what fascism and authoritarianism can mean for people resisting, I think it's also useful to have a broader conception of it. So, all is to say that it depends on how you look at it. But going to Trump specifically, no, I wouldn't say that Trump is an ideological fascist, in part because I don't think he's that ideological. I think that he wants power, he wants fame, he wants things his way, and he adjusts to how he sees the best routes to get there. That having been said, he does have a lot of fascistic qualities, which I'm sure most people in this room are already familiar with, don't need to run through that list. And his presidency has clearly emboldened and empowered the far right, and he has clearly himself parroted white nationalist talking points and has done quite a bit to embolden the far right. So when we talk about it in that way, there's a certain degree to which the question of what Trump believes is not necessarily even the most important consideration, necessarily because fascism, I think, shouldn't be understood as an all or nothing proposition. It's usually understood as either you have Hitler in power or stop complaining is marginal. But apart from the fact that, of course, fascists can be deadly in small numbers, as we've tragically seen, fascism can be understood as a spectrum of politics. And so, for example, I spoke to an anti-fascist group from Bordeaux called Pavé Brûlant, which means burning pavement. And they organize against explicit far-right groups. For example, they were at the time organizing a campaign against identitarians who were holding anti-halal events under the guise of being pro-animal rights. They were working against that very clear far-right group. But they also argued that from their perspective, every political party in France could be understood as to some extent fascistic. And in that sense, they saw fascism as a kind of creep, as a kind of politics that could worm its way just about anywhere. And so I think thinking through it in that way is useful to think about fascism, Trump, and the alt-right, because reasonable people will disagree as to how you characterize the regime or exactly how much the influence is. But if you see it as kind of an evolving spectrum, then you can organize against it from an anti-fascist perspective, broadly construed, without getting stuck in exactly what it is. So those are some thoughts. Once again, a lot of this stuff is not necessarily that clear always, but being clear on how it's unclear can be a source of clarity.
I have 3 questions.
3? Okay, well, if you could get through quick, because I just want to make sure everyone's
Sure. So you talked about networks of mutual aid,
Mhm.
and I saw a video that you did a few years ago. It was either an XRT or personal one. So I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Agreed.
Okay. So,
Sure. Networks of mutual aid, got it.
yeah, and then the second question is, post Charlottesville, there was a podcast by Bray where they talked about reaching out to our militias, I think it was the keepers of 3%. So are you aware of Antifa groups that doing propaganda or recruiting from the same places that far right papers? And the last question is, we're talking about the newspaper.
I couldn't hear on this one.
Just we're talking about the newspaper.
Is your job in this thing? Okay. All right, great. So let's start with the second question about far-right militias and so forth. So yeah, I did interview some people from Redneck Revolt who have explained that they have apparently had success showing up to gun shows with anti-racist propaganda, making connections. Like, for example, one of the stories I heard was them talking to an Italian-American Republican at a gun show about, if you really think about it, the way that your Italian ancestors were treated when they came to the U.S. is not that different necessarily from how immigrants are treated today, so maybe you shouldn't be so anti-immigrant because really you come from immigrants. And working through that, they've apparently had some success bringing people over from the right to the left. They apparently have had some people who were members of far-right militias say, Redneck Revolt is what I thought these groups were originally, but now I'm going to go in a different direction. I don't know of other initiatives like that specifically. I just don't know. So if other people do know, I'd be curious to know about that. Networks of mutual aid. So yeah, I did a little YouTube video called Anarchism in Madrid about anarchist stuff in Madrid back in 2013. And partly because it was impressive to see that there were at the time, within walking distance, 3 anarchist bars, like 3 anarchist union offices, 2 anarchist bookstores. Basically, there's a whole lot of anarchist stuff, and also communist stuff, socialist stuff, and other kinds of political tendencies. And just wanted to sort of put it out there that infrastructure is important. And so I want to give a quick shout out to Haymarket. Haymaker. An example, a great example of infrastructure. Haymarket, I'm from Chicago, right? It's in my brain. Because infrastructure, I think, is really important for the left, because waves of protest come and go, but infrastructure helps us to stand. And networks of mutual aid, of course, are benefited sometimes from having infrastructure, or at least spaces. Is there a job of the New Spain? Well, sort of. I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm very kind of like one-dimensional, sort of like it is, putting that literal question aside. Certainly, for those who don't know, the Rojava Revolution in Kurdistan is the most profound sort of social uprising of recent memory. It's socialist, it's egalitarian, facing some of the most dangerous forces in the world, the Turkish state, ISIS, Assad, and so forth. And so there is a new international brigade, essentially, of anti-fascists who have journeyed from around the world, not only to fight, but also to participate in building and educational projects and other kinds of initiatives. They use the imagery of Antifa, the flags. Some of the groups have essentially used the names of the Spanish Civil War, the International Brigade names. And so, if we think about kind of the quote-unquote heroic old anti-fascism, we see that it never went away. It still exists. Also, I think, for the kind of debates over the alleged universal superiority of exclusively non-violent political means, I'd be curious to hear someone who advocates that position describe what the Kurds should do when they're facing ISIS in the Turkish state. Because I think that is a very clear example, the clearest current example that comes to mind of sometimes you need to fight back. So thank you for your 3 questions. How are we doing on time? Doing all right?
Based I thought one of the most interesting things you said is we need to be better at politics.
Yeah.
Based on your study of history, I'm assuming you have special knowledge. But
special.
What do you wish the left today was better at?
That's a whole other presentation. Let me just try to think of one thing.
Maybe like the top.
It's such a broad question that I'm thinking. I guess maybe one thing. So one thing is, let's just throw out being able to interface with the broader society better. That's one. Because to build a new world, you need a whole lot of people. I'll leave it there. But that's one that's clearly on the list.
So you had mentioned the fascist communist from the communist movements, not so much from the elites, conservative movements in terms of how they organize. Has there ever been a point in time where the elites actually turned against the fascists and kind of allied themselves with the left, in some way? Is there any way that they've actually gone against it before?
Sure. Well, in the interwar period in France and Britain, social upheaval didn't get to the point where traditional conservatives threw their lot in with fascism. And there were times even when, a few times in France, where the police beat up some fascists at demonstrations or clashes with fascists. Today, that happens once in a while too. In Stockholm recently, there was on September 30th actually, there was a video that went around of a fascist demonstration where they ended up scuffling with the police. That is, of course, the exception. Much more often, what happens is in the other direction. And I want to just sort of take that as a segue to talk about the case of Tom Rainey briefly. So I'm just going to, since I don't know all the details, read from this little leaflet, which you can pick up over here. On August 15th, 2 anti-fascist activists were arrested on felony charges after police attacked a peaceful anti-white supremacist demonstration in front of a police station/courthouse on the north side of Chicago. Protest was outside the courthouse while a known violent white supremacist was inside facing charges of stabbing 2 people. One of the activists, Tom Rainey, is facing charges including aggravated battery to a peace officer. If Tom were to be wrongfully convicted, he could serve 3 to 7 years in prison. Tom is currently restricted by a judge's order to house arrest by an electronic monitoring device locked to his ankle while he completes trial, which could take over a year. The extreme charges and bonds appear as selective political punishment, a message for Antifa activists in Chicago just 3 days after Heather Heyer was murdered in Charlottesville. How can you help? Let the community in Chicago know that you think that these extreme charges and extraordinarily high bond are outrageous and that you support Tom's case. An anti-repression committee is helping to raise the $25,000 cash bond needed to get Tom off of house arrest. And there's more information on this form, which you can find on that. So that's more of the norm, right? That's more of the norm. Anti-fascists have a slogan, cops and Klan go hand in hand, which reflects not only the tendency of the police to actively support or look the other way with the far right. You can see even in Charlottesville, they were MIA when they were around. There were these outlandish images of the police helping pepper spray fascists in a way that they never would at a Occupy or Black Lives Matter event. But there's a larger critique that militant anti-fascists make, which is that, if you look recently in France or in Greece, the police voted for the Front National or the Golden Dawn in higher proportions than the general society. They're often the most sympathetic to the allegedly return to law and order promises of fascism, and that's not to mention the role in upholding the capitalist system and white supremacist systems more generally. So that's more the norm. But there are occasional cases, especially in some northern European countries, where the police will crack down upon and arrest fascists and white supremacists. It does happen. But anti-fascists argue that that's more of an exception than the norm, and that's certainly been the case in the U.S. The FBI has investigated extensive white power infiltration into local law enforcement. So, it's not a stretch of the imagination to think if you were a violent white supremacist, what kind of job would you want to get? Not too hard to figure that out.
Thank you so much, Mark. In that you mentioned a situation happening with Tom Rainey, we wanted to give the opportunity for Tom's partner, Lori, is here with us. She wanted to say some things and some updates on the case and let people know where it was at. And then after Lori has spoken, we can take a couple minutes right at the end, maybe some more questions if we have time.
Thanks for giving me the chance to say thank you for reading the statement about Tom's arrest. Tom was arrested, it's 2 months ago, just about exactly 2 months. And since then, he's been out of the house exactly 4 times. He's been able to go to court for his court appearances, and he gets 4 hours lots of time to come out. And yesterday, he got to meet with his lawyers. If you can imagine being shut in your house without wrong, it's demoralizing. It's isolating. It's the state silencing him. I read in the paper just this week about, there's a story about a guy who pushed someone onto the Blue Line train tracks. If you read about that, and he was given a $200,000 bond, and he posted 10%, and he's out on the streets. He's even allowed to ride the CTA. Tom was at a peaceful anti-fascist protest. He was arrested, and he was given a $250,000 bond. And now he's at home with a shackle, essentially, on his ankle, an electronic device. It actually caused him to bleed. They told him, the sheriff told him, you're not allowed on the front or back porch. You have to stay inside the house. If we drive by and you're out on the porch, we'll take you back to jail. They actually showed up unannounced one day to change the battery or change the bracelet, and they took the opportunity to harass him in that time. Tom wasn't feeling well earlier last week, and I wanted to take him to the emergency room. So there's a device in our house, a transmitter. I had to pick up this phone and wait and try for half an hour to get someone on the phone. Tell them he's not feeling well. I need to take him to the emergency room. And they said, well, you can't do that. He has to be taken by a police escort in an ambulance with fire department. So it was this huge, ridiculous show of state force in front of our house. And we had to wait for this to happen. And then they called me because he didn't come home soon enough and wasn't back in the house. The thing is, the guy who tried to murder someone on the blue line is, according to the state, less of a danger to society than my partner, who is a lifelong activist. He was first arrested at the age of 16 here in Chicago at the Armed Forces Day Parade. He ran out in front of a tank, and he's been an activist ever since. I'm very proud of him, and if any of you, his information, his email address is on this flyer. You can find him on social media. There's a link to his fundraiser page on the Black Rose Facebook page. We would just love to hear from you in solidarity. If you could just send him an email or send him a message on Facebook and let him know that you stand with him. It's been really hard, obviously not just on him, but on me. And I thank everyone for Black Rose and Haymaker especially for your support for our situation. And Tom would love to be here to thank you himself, but he can't be. So I have to speak for him.
We still have 15 minutes if there's still any more questions to be had. I think there is.
I'm interested by one of the responses you got from your interviewees where they made a distinction between direct action and inoculating society. I think that highlights a tension that perhaps is being felt maybe in a U.S. context where a lot of anti-fascist organizing happens at kind of an underground level, and a lot of that quote-unquote inoculation is separate from it somehow, and there tends to be conflicts between anti-fascist groups as to the level of visibility they're willing to have above ground. Do you have historical insights as to how that's played out in the past?
Sure, I think that's a very good characterization of some of the debates going on. I mean, there has been tension in the post-war period between what to do. I mean, that's right. So, I mean, one example that comes to mind is apparently in the Norwegian movement. The Norwegian Antifa were very much in favor of forming broad coalitions with any political party or union that was against the far right. Any of them, they would show up and create these mass counter-protests with just about anyone. They caught a lot of flack apparently from some of the Swedish anti-fascists who argued that anti-fascists, by virtue of their revolutionary and socialist politics, should only work with anti-capitalist parties or groups, and probably they had a very specific understanding of what that meant. And so, in that sense, right, there's a clear tension as far as popular politics and anti-fascism. But, of course, even more specifically, I believe that there were debates in the Anti-Racist Action Network back in the 90s over what kind of focus to pursue, right? Between popular education, between working on defense of reproductive rights versus doxing, confrontation, and so forth. It's certainly a tension. I mean, I know that there's been some critiques of some of the more open anti-fascist organizing from some people who are more in favor of more affinity group models, but my kind of 2 cents is that in the book I talk about examples of ways that these kinds of organizing can complement each other, and so I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all and there's no one single solution. I think we need all sorts of forms of organizing. They don't always coexist in the same group or at the same time, but I don't see how a movement as a whole can do without any of these facets. So part of it is also that these kinds of debates often don't happen at a really public level, right? And so the book that I wrote faster than a professional historian usually writes books, which is in the course of years. I wrote it in the course of months because I thought it was really useful to sort of stuff out with all of its imperfections. And so I didn't do the kinds of really deep archival research necessary to really get into those questions, which I think are super interesting. So to some extent I don't know. But those are important things to think through.
So I think we have time
So my question sort of actually plays into that to a certain extent, which is wondering both, I guess, historically and also if you think moving forward there's kind of a use for almost serve the people programs as a front of anti-fascist activism, whether building positive goodwill kind of play into that inoculation, even if it's not a direct response to fascism, just presenting anti-fascism as a popular movement and something that's looking out for the people.
For sure. I mean, especially since, for example, the free food to ethnic Italians and ethnic Greeks only. Even in Madrid, some of the fascist groups have even gotten into anti-eviction work to defend ethnic Spaniards who are going to be evicted. And in that sense, are trying to do some of the activism of the left better than the left to bring people to their side. So certainly, outdoing them in all this stuff is useful, especially if you have a politics beyond the state. If you think that we shouldn't just hope that the state will provide resources to these people, because part of the context, really in all these contexts, is the failure of some of these socialist parties, some of these welfare states to really provide. And so, in that sense, yeah, I certainly think that there can be an important role to be played for networks of mutual aid, for getting out there and doing prefigured politics in a way that engages people, because, there is an economic base to this, and addressing that in all sorts of ways I think is important. Yeah. Can I say one more thing before we wrap up? All right, so this is my book. I'm going to be outside afterwards with some of these.